And Mr. Kennedy, I appreciate your time. So you're Jeff Zeleny going through the role that Jill Stein played when you just look at the vote tallies in the state of Wisconsin. Only need 2,000 votes to get on the ballot in the state of Wisconsin. So what do you say to Democrats who point to Jill Stein and say, that's going to be you?
Well, right now, I don't know what I'm going to do, who I pull more from in November. Right now, I'm pulling pretty much equally, probably a little more from President Trump. As you pointed out, I want to pull from both of them. But, do you want kind of a glib answer or a thoughtful answer?
I'd always prefer thoughtful.
Okay, what I would say is you have both sides using scare tactics. Republicans say that if Joe Biden gets in, it's going to be the end of the republic. Democrats say if Donald Trump gets in, it's going to be the end of democracy. And I don't think either of them are actually going to destroy democracy. We have institutions in this country that are pretty enduring. And if you look at both those candidates, they're very different in their temperament. They're very different in their ideology, and in their rhetoric. But on the issues where they actually depart from each other, it's a very narrow band of issues. And it's the culture war issues like abortion, guns, the border, and they're all important issues. But they're not existential issues. On the existential issues, neither of them has the capacity to address them. The biggest one being the debt. We now have $34 trillion in debt. The service on that debt is more than our military spending. So, and within 5 years, 50 cents out of every dollar collected in taxes are going to go to servicing the debt. And who ran up that debt? It was President Trump and President Biden together in just 4 years each. They ran up more spending than all the previous presidents going back to George Washington combined. The chronic disease epidemic. When my uncle was president, 6% of Americans had chronic disease. Today, 60% do. It's the biggest issue we have. $4.3 trillion that we're spending on that. And it's 4 times, almost 5 times our military budget. And it's getting worse and worse. You've never heard President Trump talk about it, never heard President Biden. The polarization in our country, again, existential. All of these issues, AI, and neither of them has the capacity to deal with these. And all of those issues are created by a system of corporate capture, this corrupt merger between state and corporate power that has absolutely subverted and undermined our democracy. And neither President Trump or President Biden has the capacity to address it because they're part of that system. They're both being financed by BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard, the military contractors, the pharmaceutical industries, and that system just spits out bad policies. And the illusion that if you differ on culture war issues, it means you're radically different. But the real things that we need to do to save our country, they can't do them. And if you vote for President Trump or President Biden, they both had their chance. You're going to get more of the same. If somebody actually wants change, wants to actually alter those issues, they're going to vote for me.
And yet, to be president of the United States, if you have to be on the ballot in enough states to be able to win the Electoral College. You're not right now.
Yeah, and I will be.
You believe you will be? You believe, because I know.
I know I will be. 100%. I'm going to be on the ballot in every state in the District of Columbia. Eve, and I've said this from the beginning, and we're already well on our way there. I think within 8 weeks, we're going to probably be on another 19 states. So we were not allowed to get on the ballot before in most states because we didn't have a vice presidential candidate. You have to name a vice presidential candidate to get on the ballot in about 26 states. So now we have that. And we have about 200,000 volunteers. It's going to be easy for us to get on the ballot in every state.
So I know part of the reason that
in North Carolina, we had to get 13,000 signatures. We got 23,000. In New Hampshire, they said it would take us months to get our signatures. We got them in 1 day. In Utah, we got them in 1 week during a blizzard. So, we have a very, very good volunteer army out there.
So when you talk about that you had to have a VP candidate to get on in some of these states, right? So that's part of the reason I know you made this decision when you did. The person you've chosen is Nicole Shanahan. She's a lawyer. She doesn't have government experience. Obviously not a household name, and a lot of people have questioned why you picked her. Liz Smith of the DNC just today says she was picked for one reason and one reason only, the money. And obviously she speaks for the DNC, but Mick Mulvaney, who was OMB director under President Trump, said this.
There's one thing we need to know about her. It's the reason that Kennedy picked her for vice president. She's fabulously wealthy. This is the woman who single-handedly bankrolled his ad during the Super Bowl that cost $4 million. That's why he put her on the ticket, along with the fact that I think everybody else probably turned him down.
Would you have picked her if she didn't have the money?
Yeah, did you see her speech?
Part of it. But I'm just asking, did you pick?
I don't think anybody who watched that speech would ever say that. She was impressive. She's eloquent. She's authentic. Her life it's the template for the American dream. She started out as a minority kid in Oakland, extraordinary poverty, on food stamps, on welfare. She grew up and attended Stanford. She became a Stanford Fellow. She became an entrepreneur. She's a very, very uber successful businesswoman. She has encyclopedic knowledge of AI. She has an encyclopedic knowledge of chronic disease epidemic and how to stop it. She is young and she's a mother. And I wanted, in my candidate, I want three things. One, somebody who was not an insider, because it was the insiders who created this problem. They created the debt crisis. They created the addiction to war. They created the chronic disease epidemic. They created the polarization. I wanted somebody outside who's thinking outside of the box. Our campaign is for young people. We're the only campaign that is looking at this assault on our children, on what is happening to this young generation. So I wanted somebody who is young, who is not, an 80-year-old man. I wanted somebody who's a mother. I wanted somebody who's going to champion their issues. And I don't think anybody who looked at Nicole Shanahan's speech, which I urge people to do, would ever say that the reason that I picked her was for her money. By the way, we don't need her money to get on the ballot in every state. We already have the biggest field operation of any campaign. We are going to have no problem getting on the ballot in every state. We did not need Nicole Shanahan's money, and we're getting plenty of money. We're raising more money, our campaign is, and President Trump or President Biden.
Well, so when you talk about, though, that you say that you're pulling equally from both. Now, we'll see what happens. But in the polling that we have, but hold on one second. I'm going to just take Georgia, because we all know Georgia margin of victory last time was 11,779 votes. So the latest polling from Georgia, you get 12% of the Democratic vote. You pull 5% of the Republican vote. Again, these are polls. This is where we are right now. But that's what they show. So when you look at it that way, how can you say that your campaign is not taking more from Biden?
What I would say to you, and I'm not, this isn't something I want to argue with you about. It's just my observation is, and I don't care one way or the other, what my observation is of the Quinnipiac poll, the Harvard-Harris poll, the Gallup poll, the New York Times, Siena poll, all the leading national polls at this point in history as of today show me pulling like maybe 2 more points from President Trump than I am from President Biden. So mainly what they're showing, and the Politico did a big article on this, is my supporters are people who aren't going to vote at all, largely, and my donors are people who had given up on the American political process and are re-engaging because they feel that they don't want to choose between the lesser of two evils. They want to choose a candidate who is going to inspire them, who's going to give them hope, who has a vision for the future, and who has the vigor and energy to actually change this country. And that, I want to engage those people in the political process. The Democrats and Republicans, I'm going to take from the margins, and I can't tell you, even today, it's irrelevant, Aaron, because it's really, who am I going to take from in November?
So you, in 2000, Ralph Nader obviously was running, and you did an interview with NBC News just a few months before the election. You said this.
There's a political reality here, which is that his candidacy could draw enough votes in certain key states from Al Gore to give the entire election to George W. Bush.
And then you wrote an op-ed in the New York Times. You wrote, Ralph Nader is my friend and hero, but Mr. Nader's candidacy could siphon votes from Al Gore, Mr. Nader dismisses his spoiler role by arguing there is little distinction between the major party candidates and that Mr. Gore is compromised on too many issues. While I admire his high-minded ideals, his suggestion that there is no difference between Mr. Gore and Mr. Bush is irresponsible. A moment ago, you said you essentially see Trump and Biden as the same. Different issues. But do you really believe that when people talk about the threat to democracy that Trump poses, do you really think that that is an equal evil to Biden?
I mean, listen, I can make the argument that President Biden is a much worse threat to democracy. And the reason for that is President Biden is the first candidate in history, the first president in history that has used the federal agencies to censor political speech, so to censor his opponent. I can say that because I just won a case in the Federal Court of Appeals and now before the Supreme Court. It shows that he started censoring not just me. 37 hours after he took the oath of office, he was censoring me. No president in the country has ever done that. The greatest threat to democracy is not somebody who questions election returns, but a president of the United States who used the power of his office to force the social media companies, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, to open a portal and give access to that portal to the FBI, to the CIA, to the IRS, to CISA, to NIH, to censor his political critics. President Biden, for the first president in history, to use his power over the Secret Service to deny Secret Service protection to one of his political opponents for political reasons. He's weaponizing the federal agencies. Those are really critical threats to democracy.
Donald Trump, of course, tried to overturn a free and fair election. He tried to overturn one, right? He's still fighting in court.
Yes.
How is that not a threat to democracy?
Well, I think that is a threat to democracy. If him trying to overthrow the election clearly is a threat to democracy. But the question was, who is a worse threat to democracy? And what I would say is, I'm not going to answer that question, but I can argue that President Biden is, because the First Amendment, Aaron, is the most important. Adams and Hamilton and Madison said, we put the guarantee of freedom of expression in the First Amendment because all of our other constitutional rights depend on it. If you have a government that can silence its opponents, it has license for any atrocity.
So just to be clear, you're saying you could make an argument that President Biden is a worse threat to democracy than Donald Trump. That's what you just said.
But who else has ever tried to send, what president in history has ever tried to censor political opponents? What president has weaponized the federal agency? When my father came into the Justice Department, the first week he was there, he got all of the branch and division attorneys together, and he said, whatever we do, we are not going to use the power of the Justice Department for political
Trump, of course,
reasons.
Has said that he would do that. He has said that he would do that.
Of course, and that is reprehensible.
And he is the only president who's tried to overthrow the results of an election.
Well, let me say something about that. I'm not going to defend President Trump on that. That was appalling. And there's many things that President Trump has done that are appalling. But in 2001, we had an election stolen in this country during the Bush-Gore election. In 2004, I wrote an award-winning article for Rolling Stone that showed how that election was stolen from John Kerry. So I don't think, and most Americans agree with me about 2001, that it was a stolen election from the Democratic Party candidate. So I don't think people who say that the election is stolen, not that we shouldn't make pariahs of those people. We shouldn't demonize them. We shouldn't vilify them. What we should be doing is saying, let's all get together, Republicans and Democrats, and fix the election system so that it cannot be fixed, so that we're the exemplary democracy of the world. We ought to, Las Vegas, let me tell you this, Las Vegas is built on machines that can count and never make mistakes. Can't we make an election machine, and can't we have an electoral process that every American says whatever happens,
okay, hold on,
it can't be fixed.
I understand that we want elections to be as perfect as they possibly can be,
Yeah.
and one should not use the fact that the election was not stolen and was not cheated to not try to perfect it. I understand that distinction, but when you do as you're doing and you open the door to, well, we want every machine. You're opening the door to people who can say, well, then that's exactly what I'm saying. The machines miscounted, the machines did this, but they didn't. Every single analysis has shown that that did not happen, right? As you know. Do you worry that you're opening the door for people to
no,
believe this.
I'm
Look
not-
at the
no,
Republican
listen.
primary voters and that they believe.
I'm not worried.
Trump won.
I don't worry about how people might misinterpret my words. What I said, I mean, and I'm careful about how I use language. So I'm not saying that election was that there was cheating. I've never said that. What I've said is that there are problems, particularly, Aaron, if you don't have paper ballots. The election machines can be fixed in various ways, and that's just a fact. What we ought to have is we ought to have machines, and we ought to have paper ballots at the same time, and we ought to have a very low threshold to get a recount of the paper ballots, and that just makes sense. It's common sense, but if we implement that in every jurisdiction, you're not going to have problems where Americans at each other's throats.
I mean, so you're talking about a
fixing the-
technical thing, like instead of having 1/2 of 1% be the trigger for a recount, you would put it even lower. I mean, that's the sort of reforms you're talking about here.
Whatever. I'm not choosing a particular threshold, but a threshold that makes sense. That's a very low threshold where you get a recount if there's some question. So, and that's, I don't think I'm saying something that's controversial. I'm saying something that I think most Americans, virtually any American, would agree with. Let's have an election system that even 10% of the Americans who are crazy people, that even they won't question, because our election system is the best election system in the world. And nobody, Vermont, for example, has a very, very good election system. Nobody ever questions the Vermont election system. And we ought to be able to do the same thing in every state. We are supposed to be the template for democracy in every country in the world. Let's make sure we put a man on the moon. We've had all these accomplishments. Let's make sure we have a system that nobody is questioning, even crazy people.
People are always going to question it, though.
Well,
They're
okay.
always going to question it, and that
You want to narrow the margin of people who are questioning it to as much as possible by giving nobody any kind of legitimate claim about it. And that's all I'm saying. And what I'm saying is I'm not saying that President Trump won the election or that President Biden. I've never said anything or suggested anything like that. All I'm saying is let's focus on the issues that bring people together, rather than constantly focusing on the polarization, on the issues that drive Americans apart and have us all at each other's throats with this very, very toxic polarization and demonization of each other.
I want to ask you, I mentioned at the top of the program how Trump was trying to tie you to the far left, right, with his recent post, the most radical left candidate in the race. I guess this would mean he's going to be taking votes from crooked Joe Biden, which would be a great service to America. I love that he's running. Obviously, the Democrats were putting up billboards outside your rally, tying you to MAGA and to Trump. But it's very interesting over time, over the past 6 months, when you and Trump have spoken about each other. I wanted to play some of those times and give you a chance to explain. Here it is.
I will say RFK Jr., who I've known not very well, but I've known for a while, and I respect him. A lot of people respect him.
The people who support Donald Trump feel that they're regarded by the elites as deplorable people and that, they're not part of our country. And I think Donald Trump made them feel like they were part of our country. That
He's a very smart guy and a good guy.
I'm proud that President Trump likes me.
I was most curious, actually, about your last statement there. What about President Trump liking you makes you proud?
Well, here's the thing. And first of all, I'm definitely the only candidate running who has sued Donald Trump twice and won the lawsuits. And so, if Donald Trump does a lot of things wrong, and I call him on it, but I try to be a candidate who's not running on rancor, who's not running on vitriol, who's not running on personal attacks, but is running, based upon my record and based upon my ideas on the issues. Now, here's how, let me explain to you how I view this issue. I think there's a revolution happening in our country. And it's the same kind of thing that happened when my father was running in 1968. The polarization, the division of Americans is the most toxic it's been since the American Civil War. There's a whole group of people in this country, the American middle class, 57% of Americans who can't put their hands on $1,000 if there's an emergency in their family. For those people, if the engine light comes on in their car, it's the apocalypse. You know, they're going to lose their car, lose their job. They're feeling forgotten by the Democratic Party. They used to represent the interests of the middle class. They're feeling forgotten by the entire political establishment. Donald Trump came in 2016 and said to those people, yeah, the whole thing is fixed. And that's what they wanted to hear. Populist movements can either be harnessed by demagogues for dark reasons and with using all the alchemies of demagoguery, or they can be captured by idealistic leaders and idealistic reason. My father captured most of the white vote in Maryland, Delaware, and the eastern states just before his death in 1968. 4 years later, those same people voted for George Wallace. Why is that? They were populists. My father captured that energy with the powers and the
How would you
cause of
describe
idealism.
yourself? Are you a populist? Are you a nationalist? How would you describe
I
yourself?
would describe myself as a populist, but like my father was a populist for idealism, for America's greatest, our signature values, for democracy, for free speech, for constitution, for a democracy that's not run and captured by corporate interests, anti-war, and for the middle class, for the cops, for the firefighters, for working people in this country, about rebuilding our middle class, about making sure our kids are able to live the American dream. There's, the American dream when I was a kid said, if you worked hard, if you played by the rules, you could buy a house, you could finance it, you could take a summer vacation, you could raise a family, you could put something aside for retirement on one job. I have 7 kids, Aaron, and none of them believe that promise that applies to them. And why? And they're sick. Today, when I was a kid, juvenile diabetes, a pediatrician typically would see 1 case in his entire lifetime. Today, 1 out of every 3 kids who walks into his office is pre-diabetic or diabetic. Why isn't the political establishment, we're spending more on diabetes than we are a defense budget. Why isn't the political establishment talking about this? We ought to be solving this problem.
So
why are our health agencies never even asking this question?
you just mentioned 7 children.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, as we sit here and you're doing this interview, you're doing interviews, you're doing rallies, and you're running. The candidacy that you're running has cost you a lot personally. It has cost you siblings, family members have spoken out against what you're doing. They are angry, they're upset, they're hurt. Your sister Rory was on our show recently and she spoke about it. JFK's grandson also posted on social media overnight something. I don't know if you saw it. I wanted to play both of them.
I feel strongly that this is the most important election of our lifetime. And I do worry that Bobby just taking some percentage of votes from Biden could shift the election and lead to Trump's election.
He's trading in on Camelot, celebrity, conspiracy theories, and conflict for personal gain and fame. I've listened to him. I know him. I have no idea why anyone thinks he should be president. What I do know is his candidacy is an embarrassment.
That's your
It was
family.
fine.
That's your family.
Yeah, I have a big family. There's about 105 cousins on the last time we counted.
Roy's your
July.
sister.
Yeah, and I have siblings who are supporting me. I have cousins and nephews and nieces who are working in my campaign. My campaign is being run by my daughter-in-law. The political party that we started is chaired by my cousin Anthony Shriver. But listen, I have a big family. I don't know anybody in America who's got a family who agrees with them on everything. I don't know if that's your situation, Aaron, if you just have a family who believes everything you do is, like unicorns and rainbows. But I come from a family, from a milieu where we came home at night and ate dinner with my father, and he would orchestrate debates between us, and we were in the same way that his father did with him. And we could disagree on issues, and we could disagree with passion and information, but we still love each other. And I love Rory. I love my family. I feel loved by them. Listen, I understand why they don't like me running. I understand President Biden has been a 40-year friend to me and my family. He has a bust of my father behind him on the Oval Office.
Yes,
He
we've
talks
talked
about
about
how my
that.
father inspired him to enter politics. There's 5 members of my family who work for the Biden administration. So, I understand why they're dismayed that I'm running against him. They're also worried that, what my sister said, that, my candidacy may get Trump elected.
What
I
happens
get
if
it.
it does?
I
What happens if you wake up the day after the election, we have results, and that is what happened?
Well,
Will you regret it?
what I said to you applies to that. I don't think either President Trump or President Biden are going to solve the debt crisis in this country, which is existential. I don't think either of them are going to get us out of foreign wars, this addiction that we have to forever wars. President Trump actually said he was going to do that, but then he appointed John Bolton. He said he was going to drain the swamp. He appointed John Bolton as head of NSA, and that's, John Bolton is a swamp creature. He's the template for swamp creatures. I don't think that either of them are capable of ending the corporate capture of all of our agencies, the capture of the CIA by the military-industrial complex, the capture of NIH, CDC, and FDA by the pharmaceutical companies, the capture of USDA by processed food and big ag. They're not going to do anything about that. So it's going to be more of the same, whoever gets elected. There's going to be changes around the margins, like that tax on abortion or whatever.
Okay.
But both of them only have 4 years, and I don't think they can dismantle democracy in 4 years. I think Americans' institutions are too great for that, and the chance for me to actually change the nature of governance in this country, to restore democracy, to restore our nation's moral authority abroad, give us a foreign policy that's not based on war or projecting military power abroad, but on projecting economic power and moral strength. The chances of that happening are too great and too important for me to give up this contest.
All right. Bobby Kennedy, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time.
Aaron, thanks for having me.
All right. And I want to go now to Daniel Dale. And Daniel, a lot of things that Kennedy said in that interview deserve a little bit more attention, including his claim that he made that the 2004 election was, quote, stolen from John Kerry. Towards the end, he made that point. I'll just play it again.
In 2001, we had an election stolen in this country during the Bush-Gore election. In 2004, I wrote an award-winning article for Rolling Stone that showed how that election was stolen from John Kerry. So I don't think, and most Americans agree with me about 2001, that it was a stolen election from the Democratic Party candidate.
So, Daniel, that's not something that a lot of people have heard, the 2004 election, okay? And it stood out to you along with a few other key moments there.
It did. So he did write an article about this in 2006 in Rolling Stone, claiming that the election was stolen from John Kerry because of what happened in the state of Ohio, then an important swing state. That article did not actually prove the election was stolen. It raised a litany of some very real problems that nonetheless did not show that Kerry would have won the state if not for those problems. It also made, like in many cases with Mr. Kennedy, a whole bunch of speculative leaps, assumptions about data that experts in things like exit polling said were just not true. So no, there was no proof the election was stolen in 2004 from Mr. Kerry. Mr. Kennedy also made some other claims there, and I think we need to look at. He asserted that President Biden has denied him Secret Service protection in this election. First of all, there is no evidence that President Biden has been at all personally involved in decisions about who should and should not get Secret Service protection. Secondly, I think it's important to note that there are federal criteria for who gets such protection, including such things as being the nominee of a major party, which Mr. Kennedy is not, being at 15% or higher consistently for a month in the Real Clear Politics polling average, with which Mr. Kennedy currently is not. Now, there is some discretion. The Secretary of Homeland Security, yes, part of the Biden administration, can decide to offer protection, but there's no evidence this has been a decision from Mr. Biden to put him at risk. He also claimed that President Biden has been personally censoring him. We know there is a controversy about White House communications with social media companies about what posts and accounts should remain up or not. There is no evidence that Biden has been involved whatsoever. And it's important to remember he was posting frequent serial vaccine and other COVID-19 misinformation. That's what we're talking about here, not political criticism.
All right, which is obviously very significant to note that distinction. All right, thanks to Daniel Dale. Jeff Zeleny is back with me now. And in addition, Ashley Allison joins, former National Coalitions Director for the Biden-Harris 2020 campaign, and David Urban, former senior advisor to the Trump campaign. So, Ashley, you hear Kayla, the DNC, they're watching Kennedy. They we saw they put the big billboard up saying that he's MAGA, trying to tie him to Trump. You just heard him describe himself as a populist. So what do you make of the way he's dealing with this right now?
Look, I think RFK's interview you just did was terrifying. Not only did he push lie after lie and some conspiracy theories, he actually didn't say one time what he would do for the American people. He talked about them, but he didn't make a clear plan for what he wants to do for them. He will be a spoiler, most likely. He is not on enough, you asked him this, he is not on enough ballots right now to actually get 270 electoral college votes, which you actually need to win the presidency of the United States. And he talked about so many issues that are baffling to me, but he talked about chronic disease. Yes, chronic disease is an issue, but he also said that abortion rights, half of the population has lost a constitutional right, and that's not an existential crisis. He talked about guns, which is the leading cause of death for children. He talked about being the candidate for young people, but doesn't consider the gun crisis in our country an existential crisis. He talked about Joe Biden being a bigger threat to democracy and not Donald Trump, when Donald Trump had people go and storm the Capitol, try to kill not only Nancy Pelosi, but his vice president, Mike Pence, who is no longer supporting Donald Trump. So his candidacy is extremely problematic. The DNC needs to take it head on. Robert F. Kennedy is a problem for America as a candidate.
Jeff Zeleny, what do you make of the argument that he made? And how will that play from where you're hearing it? That he was saying that you could make the argument, he was making the argument that Joe Biden could be a greater threat to democracy than Donald Trump, even though he said that what Donald Trump did in January was wrong.
Look, his point there was because of social media, as Daniel was saying, that he argues that he was blocked from social media. But listening to that is not something that certainly would resonate with most disaffected Democratic voters. So that certainly sounds like and gives credence to the idea that, yes, he is going to take supporters potentially from both sides. That's very much more of a Republican or Trumpian message, if you will. But, Aaron, I think one of the things that struck me when you talk to Democrats who truly are upset and disgusted and disappointed at this administration, one of the reasons is the Gaza policy. And there would be an opening, talking to many Democrats, if there was a candidate, a third-party option who was really making that the core of their message. That could be a problem for young voters. That is not the core of RFK Jr.'s message at all.
No,
so
in fact,
I think in terms of young voters, it's hard to imagine that he would speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, even 10 days ago, he was not even saying there was time for a ceasefire. Biden, of course, is much more ceasefire than RFK. I'd be more pro-Israel than Biden or Trump right now, it appears. So, David, can I just show you the map again? Because you heard Kennedy make the argument that he's going to get on the ballot in all states. Right now, he's only on the ballot formally in Utah. Says he's got the signature threshold for 8 other states, and that does include key swing states, Michigan, Georgia, Nevada, Arizona, North Carolina, all on that. Do you believe that he will be successful in getting on the ballot in enough states where you would be competitive from an electoral college perspective to 270?
Well, we'll have to wait and see on that. First of all, I'd like to yield my time to Daniel Dale to come fact check Allison, but I know we don't have enough time, so I'll do it. So clearly, Democrats are concerned, very, very concerned, because what I hear Ashley saying is what I hear over and over again about RFK Jr. Right? He's a bigger threat to democracy than Donald Trump, so you can't vote for either of those two. But to your point, is he going to be on the ballot in enough states? I think he's going to be on the ballot in plenty of states. I think he's going to have the money. He may be on the libertarian ticket to get, and if that's the case, then he's on every state. He'll get Secret Service protection then. Yeah. And so we've got a lot of road to run down here yet. I will say, listening to him, what he sounded like, I feel your pain, America. I feel your pain about the check engine light going on. he really has a pretty populist message that I think is going to resonate. I think at the end of the day, the Democrats should be plenty scared of RFK because he's a relatable. I've spent only a little bit of time with him, but he's an interesting character, very relatable, very very likable, affable guy on the campaign trail, and it's gonna be a problem if he gets out there and gets on these ballots.
All right. Thank you all very much.